Hello, everyone. This is Professor Mencken, and this chapter, chapter 5, is the first of three major chapters on sociological theories of crime. In this chapter, we will talk about two primary forms of crime, strain and cultural deviance. And there's a subset of theories within each of these two categories we will discuss. The first video, this one, is about strain theories. So just to kind of give you a quick recap, so we spent the first four chapters of the book talking about the history of criminology, talking about sources of data and some of the problems, the benefits, and the burdens of those data. Chapter 3 was on sort of historical biological theories of crime emerging in the late 1800s, 1900s, or early 1900s. And then we also talked about in chapter 4 some more modern versions of biological and psychological theories of crime. What we're going to talk about now is the sociology of crime. And we're going to start with strain theory, the most prominent theory in our field. But before we go to strain theory, we got to talk a little bit about what was called the Chicago School. And so if I can get this here. All right. So the Chicago School is a group of scholars that did research at the University of Chicago. And what they noticed is that at the time, this is in the early 1900s, the first half of the 20th century, from about 1900 to 1950, Chicago was going through a radical change, going through significant population growth due largely to immigration of people from overseas and immigration from people from down south, which is called the Great Migration. As after the Civil War, for decades after the Civil War, large numbers of African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities, Chicago being the primary city they moved to. So what happened in the early 20th century, you see here on the screen, I've got aspirations meet frustration. So what that means is, with strain theories, the idea that aspirations, I aspire to do great things and live a good life, but what happens is those dreams get frustrated by the material conditions in which you live. And that's essentially what happened in neighborhoods in Chicago. So Gerhard Linsky is a famous sociologist who talked about the 5 stages of transition of societal types. And we currently live in what's called a post-industrial or information age society. But the time period of the Chicago School was the transition from the third great stage of society, which is called the agricultural stage, which lasted for about 5,000 years, to the industrial stage, which lasted for about 200 years. And the early 20th century is the prime era of the industrial stage of human history. We had in 2 great waves of migration from people overseas to the United States. We had one in the late 1700s / early 1800s. And then we had a second great wave of migration in which 20 million people left Europe and came to the United States. They were primarily from Eastern and Central Europe. They came in the early 1900s, 1910, 1920. Some came before war broke out. Some came after the war was over, World War I, that is. They came from Central Europe, a lot of Italian immigrants, a lot of Russian immigrants, a lot of Polish immigrants. We had and lots of Western European Catholics, primarily from Ireland and Germany. So what happened is that in the 1920s, Chicago doubled in size. And when that happens, we'll see here in a couple of slides later, but when a population grows rapidly, it creates a lot of sudden change, and it creates a lot of turmoil. It can create rising crime rates, and we'll explain why that is here throughout this chapter. And then because Chicago was going through this rapid transition, the sociologists at the University of Chicago were noticing that some neighborhoods in Chicago had more crime rates than others. And they wanted to know why that was. And so what they essentially did was they started studying crime in Chicago and focusing on how it varies by the type of neighborhood. So what they were primarily interested in is how factors in the social environment create different crime rates across neighborhoods. So is crime higher in neighborhoods that have poorer social environments than in neighborhoods that do not? What's unique about the sociology theories compared to biology and psychology, which we studied in chapter 4, is that in the previous theories, the unit of analysis was the individual. We want to explain why a person commits a crime. Is it a biological function? Do they have some sort of genetic code? Do they have the chromosome issue? Do they have a problem with their brain? Or is it something about their personality or that lends them to, commit crimes? Now, there are good, sound reasons to believe that personality is linked to crime. But what there is not good, sound reason to believe is that groups of people who live in the same neighborhood all have the same personality. That's not something that's necessarily accepted. And so we have to explain why crime rates are higher in some neighborhoods than others. Then we have to study groups of people. What are those people who live in those high crime neighborhoods? What characteristics do they have in common? And in low crime neighborhoods, what characteristics do those people have in common? This is very different from the psychological method of studying individual problems. It has its place in criminology, no doubt. When we study serial killers, we'll see trends, but serial killers, they're not, they don't all come from the same neighborhood. They tend to all be white men, mostly. Not exclusively, but mostly. But they do have personality disorders that lend to that. I think that serial killing, you can't really talk about it sociologically. We can certainly talk about gang violence sociologically. We can talk about organized crime like the mafia sociologically, because these are pathologies that are manifested in group behavior, not individual behavior. All right, well, let's move on. All right, the father of criminology really is a guy in the sociology of criminology. There's a guy named Emil Durkheim. If you took a social theory class, if you took a sociology theory class, you'll know who Durkheim is. Durkheim was mentioned in Sociology 1305, your intro class, although probably not in much detail. So Durkheim lived through the last half of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century up into World War I. He was a French sociologist. And one of the things he's most famous for is this idea of anomie. And anomie is a state of being that happens when we see rapid social change. And we'll talk a little about a current example of this. So anomie means a state of normlessness. And remember, norms are those rules that make society work. Those are the norms, the rules that we follow, both formal and informal, that allow us to live a settled, patterned life. And so anomie is when these norms and rules disappear. When does anomie occur? Well, it can occur suddenly, such as when a natural disaster strikes. It occurred suddenly to us in the spring of 2020 when the coronavirus forced the United States into essentially what was about a 6 to 8 week lockdown. Okay? People lived, the rules that we were used to living by all of a sudden didn't apply anymore. You didn't go to work. You didn't leave your house. You couldn't just go to the grocery store and get things. You couldn't go to the movies. You couldn't do the things, you couldn't live the pattern of life you were used to living. And some people, this hurt them. Some people freaked out about this. We had cases of suicide because of this. We call this normlessness, and you will recall that the media throughout COVID lockdown kept talking about the new normal. So they're trying to insert new norms we're supposed to follow because the old normal, the old norms we followed disappeared. All right. We're now trying to social distance and we're expected to wear masks in public, but some people don't want to wear the mask in public. Troubling times, lots of enemy, lots of unrest. We saw protests at state capitals because they didn't like, some people didn't like the fact that we were still on lockdown or we were on lockdown for as long as we were. People lost their jobs, people lost their income. It was a very tumultuous time. And at the same time, the virus was spreading and it killed, at the time of this taping, over 110,000 people. And it's still killing people and it's still spreading. This is a state of normlessness. All right, so why is this important? Well, Durkheim did a study of social crime statistics and particularly focused on suicide, which is technically a crime. He argued that anomie increases during times of rapid social change. Okay? And so what happens is that when you have anomie, it loosens the bonds. The disappearance of those norms allow people to engage in all forms of deviant behavior. It also allows them to commit suicide. And he conducted a very famous study to prove his assertions. He also believed that there was religious differences in suicide, that Protestants and Catholics, that Protestants had higher suicide rates than Catholics. And we'll talk about this here in just a second. So that's what he did. He studied the suicide rates between Protestant countries and Catholic countries. What he found is that he expected Protestant countries to have higher suicide rates. And found, in fact, that Protestant countries do have high suicide rates. And he attributed this to the Protestant-Catholic dichotomy between individualism and communalism, whereas Catholicism is much more about, or at least in Durkheim's ideas, is that the whole basis of Catholicism is this communal relations among believers, and they seek God through the church. Whereas Protestants sort of believe that, you can seek God as an individual. And people who believe that, for the longest time, it's really turns out not to be all that true, but for the longest time, people believe that countries that are predominantly Protestant were much more individualistic in nature than countries that are predominantly Catholic. Although, the hardcore data on this don't really show a lot. But what Durkheim found is that, Protestant countries had higher suicide rates. But what is probably most important from Durkheim's work is this idea of egoistic versus altruistic suicide. So let's take our little magic pen. And so he came out with 4 types of suicide. And we're not going to worry about anomic and fatalistic. That's just, those are not issues we're really going to deal with right now. What he argues that in industrial society, there were 2 basic types: anomic suicide, in which regulations were too weak. The rules just weren't strong enough to give people guidance in life. And egoistic suicide, where the bonds were too weak. And what I mean by that is that people just aren't connected to each other. And so both of these things can happen in rapid social change. Okay? So at rapid social change, when it breaks down all the rules, the norms that people follow, you can get a sense of anomic suicide. Okay? And so anomic suicide is for people, for example, who commit suicide during natural disasters. Some people committed suicide when the stock market crashed in 1929, and they did lose everything, but they felt like they had nothing left. And people who committed suicide during the pandemic were people who just felt, they were overly stressed out about the lack of rules to follow. The other form of suicide that in industrial society is called egoistic suicide. And this is when the bonds are too weak. And Durkheim argues that when there's rapid social change, people get disconnected from one another, and you live as an isolated, lonely individual. And people who live as isolated, lonely individuals have a very higher probability of committing suicide. Okay. Also, with Regulation 2E, we're going to study a form of anomic suicide this semester. We're going to look at the suicide rates among the subgroups of race, age, sex, region of the country subgroups of the United States. And we're going to find something pretty interesting there. And the reason why the suicide rates are going to be higher for this particular group is that essentially the norms by which they were used to living have disappeared. And they've kind of given up on life. Now, altruistic suicide happens when bonds are too strong. And so this classic case here would be the Heaven's Gate group. Or the Heaven's Gate are the people, if you don't know who they are, they're this crazy group of people who believe that they were going to be swept up on a spaceship and taken to a new life plane, like a higher level of existence. They were going to shed their earthly bodies and assume a new form. And they committed ritual suicide in San Diego, California in 1997, I think, 96, 97, I forget the year. But it was in San Diego, and they all dressed alike in these funky little jogging suits. And they expected that behind the Hale-Bopp comet that was visiting Earth at the time, there was a passing by Earth, that there was a spaceship in the tail of that comet that was going to scoop them up and take them. Now, this is craziness. And if you want to know more about Heaven's Gate, just Google it. There's 1,000 videos on these people. But that's the idea of the bonds being too strong. You know, the bonds among these believers, they just bought into this and they committed suicide. When the rules are too strong, this is a classic example. Some of you, I was a kid. I was in 8th grade, I think, 7th going into 8th grade when this happened. This was the Jonestown Massacre in French Guiana. Reverend Jim Jones, the People's Temple, moved all his parishioners down to this plot of land in French Guiana. And this is where the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" comes from. They committed mass ritual suicide. Basically, they were forced to commit suicide because of the rules and regulations of the group. Hundreds of people, children included, committed suicide by drinking the poisoned Kool-Aid. That's an example of the rules being too strong. And we're not, these altruistic and fatalistic are really for a different type of class than this. Fatalistic in particular for religion. Both of these would be really good in sociology of religion. We're going to focus on anomic and egoistic. What happens when the rules break down? What happens when the bonds to other people break down? It frees people up to be deviants, to commit crime, to do all kinds of horrible things, but also to commit suicide when they realize they just can't deal with it anymore.